Latin America and the implications for the United States. This program is co-sponsored by the Center for Hemispheric Policy at the University of Miami. I had the pleasure of reading Dr. Fleischman's book, and I was impressed by its clarity, by its importance as a source of information on events that are happening right now in Latin America, such as the expansion of Chavismo in the area, the weakening of democracy, the connection between Venezuela and Cuba, the connection between Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, and he has two very interesting chapters on the role of the Russians in Latin America and the role of the Chinese, and some predictions about the future of Latin America. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a dialogue, Dr. Fleischman and I, for about 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it to the public. Luis, first of all, why did you write this book?
Okay, well, first of all, I take this opportunity to thank you, to thank the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies, as well as the Center for Hemispheric Policy for co-sponsoring it. Special thanks to you. And also to Maria del Carmen Urizar, Susie Davis at the center, and of course everyone else who helped me, particularly my wife Laura, who is here, and my representative, public relations representative, Margarita Puyes. Why did I write this book? Now, to answer the question. There was a lot of coverage of Chávez and Chavismo and what Venezuela is about. Most of the interpretations that I found were mainly economic, or they were political, more oriented to, let's say, the social causes that brought about. Tended to expand, tended to reach to other countries as well, and create similar regimes. And that indeed happened. Happened in Ecuador, happened in Bolivia, happened in Nicaragua. And of course, they talk about the socialism of the 21st century. Well, I had the feeling that what was needed here, and of course there were those who actually placed a lot of emphasis on the relations between Chávez and Hezbollah, Chávez and the FARC, and Chávez and Iran, and they said Chávez is a threat. I agreed with that, but the question was what kind of threat Chávez represented. So what I found what was needed was to connect the dots, to provide a theoretical framework through which we can understand this reality. Most of the information was in pieces. Chávez is a communist. Chávez has connections to the FARC and Hezbollah. Chávez hates the Americans. It's all truth, but how exactly can we conceptualize what the threat of Chávez is about? And this is the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to try to make sense of all the facts and put them together, connecting the dots and providing a framework through which we can understand the reality.
Looking at Cuba and reading your book, you describe Chavismo as anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-Western.
Right.
So is Cuba. So is Chavismo Castrismo with dollars?
Well,
or in other words, in a different way, what is the difference between Chavismo and Castrismo?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. I think Castro actually follows the communist revolution. And I think they follow the Soviet footprint. Chavismo, I would say, they try to follow more or less the same. But I think the main difference is that Chavismo, contrary to Castrismo, has been successful. Has been successful in expanding to other countries, has been successful in reaching out to the grassroots. Like, for instance, you have indigenous movements that support Chávez. You have the grassroots of the Partido de Trabajadores, the Workers' Party in Brazil that supports Chávez. You have grassroots organizations such as the Movimiento Sin Tierra, the landless movement in Brazil, also supports Chávez, and several other organizations that actually view Chávez as a hero, including the ruling party in Uruguay, for instance. And not to speak about also the grassroots in Argentina, in the Peronist party and also in some of the other movements. So one of the misconceptions, in my opinion, is to say that Chavismo is basically a puppet movement of Castrismo. I don't agree with that. I believe that Chavismo is autonomous, the Bolivarian revolution is autonomous, it has its own ideology, which tends to unify Latin America under what is called 21st socialism. And of course, Cuba, remember that after the Soviet Union cut the funding of Cuba in 1990, everyone expected Cuba, the question on when the Cuban regime would collapse was a matter of time. People say, well, soon we will have a change in Cuba in the same way we had in the countries of the former Soviet Union. But the reality is that Chávez provided a lifeline to Cuba. Therefore, Cuba is more dependent on Chávez, on Chavismo, than Chavismo is dependent on Cuba. The greatest dependence of the Bolivarian regime on Cuba is the advice that they get from the Cubans, particularly in terms of how to create an authoritarian state, how to create a strong, repressive, oppressive authoritarian state.
You mentioned that Cuba has 50,000 advisors in Venezuela.
That's correct.
That not all of them are advising. Some of them are supervising. Some of them are helping to create a security apparatus in Venezuela. So like the Germans and the Stasi helped Cuba organize its intelligence, I think Cuba is doing the same thing in Venezuela.
That's correct, yes. But still, that is not enough to say there is like a dependency. I think the thesis that Chavismo is a continuation or a function or, the continuation of Castrismo is still, I think the Cubans are there at the request of Chávez.
Sure.
And they are there because Chávez is fascinated by the type of repressive state that Cuba created, an authoritarian state, particularly the control of state over society.
And you correctly point out that tactically the Chavistas use a different weapon than Cuba used. Cuba used violence to achieve power in most of Latin America.
That's correct.
The Chavistas have gone into the bottom of society, organizing groups from the bottom up, influencing elections, taking advantage of the democratic process to
That is correct.
Power.
And there is no communist ideology in Chavismo. We don't see Marxism. Mostly the influences that Chávez is under are mostly theories of power. You know, the union between the military and the people. Mostly, if you look, and I analyze that in chapter 2, is that the main philosophy of Chávez and the philosophy of government of Hugo Chávez is precisely a philosophy of a strong government. They don't even mention the working class, they don't mention Marxism, they don't mention they don't even quote them.
One of the parts that you place significant emphasis is in the Iranian interest, not only in Venezuela, but in the rest of Latin America. What is Iran up to? What are they interested in? What are they doing?
The interpretation that is the most accepted of all, and is a very common interpretation, and that's the interpretation of the State Department, is that Iran is seeking to avoid the isolation and the international sanctions to which it is subjected. In my opinion, that explanation is insufficient. It's very important to know what is exactly the agenda of the Iranians and what is the agenda of the Chavistas. And in my opinion, what is going on between Iran and the Bolivarian Revolution is that both serve each other well. Iran has the possibility of getting certain materials from Venezuela, particularly uranium, and there have been reports about the presence of uranium, extraction of uranium that goes to Iran for enrichment. Of course, they are looking to avoid sanctions through the banks, that I also mentioned, and that's correct. I mean, I'm not arguing with this. And at the same time, they are establishing a strong political and economic presence in Latin America. But at the same time, remember that the Iranians are in Latin America mostly also at the request and the invitation of Hugo Chávez. And this is, I mean, they had a presence before, but under Hugo Chávez, the presence of the Iranians intensified even more. And there is a reason for that. And this is because the Iranians also could provide a tool for the survival of the Bolivarian regime. First of all, they are experts in asymmetric war, namely terrorism. They have been doing it in Iraq, they have been doing it in Afghanistan, and they are doing it almost all over. They are doing it now in Syria. So therefore, in case Chávez needs to mobilize the paramilitary and all the forces to defend the regime, or even promote revolutions abroad, you know, extend the Bolivarian revolution abroad, they can use the Iranians. Now, the Iranians have another interest here that I think is, in my opinion, should be taken into consideration, particularly by the foreign policy establishment. Iran is now very close to achieving, to obtaining a nuclear weapon. If they obtain a nuclear weapon, there is a possibility that those nuclear weapons be posted on Venezuelan soil, in the same way that in 1962, the Russians under Khrushchev posted nuclear weapons on Cuban soil, if you recall well. And that's a possibility. Some people may say that's crazy, they're not going to do it, this is risky, but that's a possibility. And given the passivity that the US foreign policy is displaying now, I think the Iranians would be more tempted to do something like that. And if that becomes the case, the United States would be vulnerable to a nuclear attack as much as Israel would be in case the Iranians obtain a nuclear weapon. So the Iranians will have a very effective second strike capability or first strike capability. It will be a good way to put the United States under threat. Now, how the United States is going to react to something like that, I don't know. But that's a possibility that we need to take into account. And not to speak about the possibility, remember, Chávez was talking about creating a nuclear village with the Iranians, and that came at the end of the year 2009. They talk about cooperation on nuclear issues between Iran and Venezuela. So that means that we also have the possibility of that the Iranians could be helping the Venezuelans to develop their own nuclear weapon. That's a possibility too. I'm not saying that this is an immediate problem, but in the long run, it could be a problem.
Luis, there's another line of thinking that talks about weakening the United States in Latin America. That all of these actions by the Cubans, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, are aimed at withdrawing Latin America from the US spheres of influence. In producing the natural resources will cost much more to the United States, and therefore creating enormous inflation and problems in the United States. So if you withdraw or you destroy American investments in Latin America, you withdraw the natural resources in Latin America, naturally that would have an enormous impact. So this is, I think, part of the threat that you're talking about to the United States.
Yeah, even though if the United States supports what is called free trade, I think it's fair game. I mean, you can lose in the competition. At this point, we have a huge Chinese presence, particularly in technology and in the economy in Latin America. For instance, Brazil and the United States used to be the main trade partner of the, Brazil used to be the, I'm sorry, the United States used to be the main trade partner of Brazil, and now China is the main trade partner of Brazil. But what is interesting about China is that a lot of people believe, many people believe that China has an economic agenda. All they are looking is to grow economically. The Chinese also look to increase their influence politically. And the situation now is that the United States controls or dominates the Chinese backyard. We have a very strong relation with the Japanese. We have a very strong relation with the Philippines. We have a strong relation with South Korea. And the Chinese, and I explain that in my book, the Chinese are looking to increase their military capabilities. For instance, they have they gathered a number of Chinese experts on military affairs, and they are trying to build a huge navy, for instance. And they are trying to follow the American model of the navy. So the Chinese, they want to convert this economic power into political power. And the problem is not so much that the United States loses economically in Latin America. Of course, that's a problem. But the problem could be that China may have a political agenda there. And their main political agenda is going to be to support the Bolivarian regimes and all the countries of ALBA and help perpetuate those regimes. And that creates a geopolitical problem that is very serious, because in the same way that China, for instance, confronts the United States on the issue of Sudan, Iran, or Syria, they are going to protect also Venezuela, and they are going to protect all its partners in the ALBA coalition. And that they are going to perpetuate Chavismo in the continent, and I think that's a major danger, I would say.
How about the rise of Russia now as a world power and their interest in selling weapons in Latin America? They sold, I don't know, $12 billion worth of weapons to Chávez.
Yes, I think this is where their strength is mostly military supplies. I don't think they are as dangerous politically as the Chinese are, frankly. I think they are dealing also with a lot of internal problems. But they supply weapons. This is what they know. I mean, their military industry actually developed during the Cold War, or even before that. And the problem of the military supplies is that they are actually supplying military equipment to Bolivarian countries, of course also Syria. But, and what is most interesting is that Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, passed weapons to the FARC. And these weapons actually were Russian-made weapons that were sold to the Venezuelans, and the Venezuelans transferred it to the FARC. And I think this is very dangerous. But based on what I see in terms of, I don't trust the Russians particularly, but
Putin is a very nice guy.
But I see China as being more of a problem than Russia.
One of the concerns about Russian weapon sales is that weapon sales is a chain. In other words, it's not only the selling of the weapons, but it's the training of the militaries in the country,
right,
sending advisors, and then creating a chain to provide spare parts. And that reorients those militaries toward Russia. But it's going to be a bigger problem than it is now, I don't know.
Oh yes, there is no question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, most of the weaponry that the Venezuelan army has actually is American. So I think it's going to take a while until they replace all this. But I agree. I mean, the fact that they supply weapons to the Bolivarian countries, and particularly to Venezuela, is a problem. And the fact that these weapons actually reach to the FARC, I think is even more of a problem. So yes, indeed.
In your book, you talk quite a bit about the lack of awareness in the American public, in the media, and in the Congress and in the government of the United States about these problems. Is it a lack of awareness, or is it that they don't know what to do, or is it that they don't care? What is it?
I think they don't know what to do. I think it's like a hot potato. Chapter 8 actually analyzes American policy toward Latin America and analyzes the two administrations, the Bush administration and also the Obama administration. The Bush administration was too busy after 9/11 in dealing with Afghanistan and the Middle East. They didn't give priority. The White House, George Bush was concerned about Chávez and Venezuela, but George Bush was too busy. The White House was concentrated mostly on, as I said before, the Middle East and Afghanistan. So they left everything in the hands of the State Department. And the State Department, what the conception of the State Department was ignore Chávez. If you ignore Chávez, he will go away. You know, let's try to act as if, you know, he didn't exist. And the idea was that, you know, eventually, and something that I said previously before, that the oil prices are going to go down and then Chávez is going to collapse. You know, somebody else will be elected. They never understood that Chávez was creating an authoritarian state, and the whole, even though there were elections in Venezuela, the whole regime that Chávez was building was to perpetuate itself in power. So, to perpetuate the regime in power, the regime itself in power. So, I think they failed to understand Chavismo from the beginning. Even Condoleezza Rice, if you look at the memories of Condoleezza Rice in her book, her last book, I don't remember the name of the book now, but she says she rejoices over the fact that she saw Chávez in one of the meetings and she ignored him. And then she says, well, what a great thing I did, I ignored Chávez. But that doesn't help, of course. And under President Obama, I think the problem is the White House itself, because the White House Obama came to the White House with the idea that America is the bully of the world. That was after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and therefore the idea was not to bully Latin America. Let's treat Latin American countries with respect and with equal partnership. And even Dan Restrepo, who is the main advisor in the White House for President Obama, he said the reason why Chávez is the way he is because of George Bush. He said that. You can find it in the internet. The Obama administration did not deal with the issue, partly because it's a hot potato. They don't know what to do. But they fell in the trap, and that's another thing that I touch in my book, of what the rest of Latin America wanted. And they remained passive. Brazil, for instance, George Bush expected that Brazil could be a good counterbalance to the Bolivarian revolution, and it didn't work. Brazil eventually ended up supporting the Bolivarian revolution. Not in the same way like Ecuador did, or Bolivia, but Brazil became a major enabler of Hugo Chávez. They saw it as a symbol of the revolution. And remember, Chávez and Lula knew each other from the Foro of Sao Paulo. So the Obama administration failed, for instance, to enforce the democratic charter of the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States actually remained passive when Nicaragua committed a major fraud in the municipal and the presidential elections. And they didn't say a word. They spoke up when the president of Paraguay was impeached. Of course, they spoke up when the president of Honduras was ousted. But they didn't speak up when Chávez violated over and over again human rights, imprisoned people for no reason, tried to subjugate the judiciary to the executive, put a judge in jail because her verdict was not according to what Chávez wanted. All these things were not denounced. They put restrictions on the press. The only body that actually denounced all these things and even wrote a report about it is the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, that is the Human Rights Commission of the OAS. But that was ignored by the political leadership of the OAS, was ignored by Insulza, and was ignored by the leaders of the rest of the countries. And the United States failed to take the lead and say, no, let's enforce the OAS democratic charter. This is why I think the culture in the OAS today, in the Organization of American States, is more to stand with democracy only when we have an event that looks more like the coup d'etats of yesterday than of the violations of democracy today by leaders that were democratically elected.
So if you were advising Obama, what would you tell him to do?
What I would say to him is try to convince Brazil to be more committed to democracy. I believe that if Brazil changes its attitude, I think something can move. If the United States takes the lead in trying to enforce the OAS democratic charter, I think it's going to be a good first step. I'm not saying that this step is sufficient, but it's a good first step. And the reason is the following. That the violation of democracy by the Bolivarian states is also a geopolitical problem, and that's also another point in the thesis of my book. Why? Because when you have a leader elected democratically, but at the same time imposes an authoritarian rule, and then you have another one in Ecuador doing the same thing, and another one in Bolivia doing the same thing, and another one in Nicaragua doing the same thing, and another one in Honduras, in case Zelaya actually didn't work for Zelaya, doing the same thing, you are talking about a handful of people, no more than 5 or 6 people, making decisions that are dangerous. I'll give you an example. Venezuela was the first, Chávez was the first one to start a relationship with the Iranians, the FARC, and the drug cartels. But then the Ecuadorians followed suit, and they expelled the DAA also. And the Nicaraguans followed suit, and the Bolivians followed suit. So this is why democracy, if you can enforce democracy in the same way, I'm not saying exactly in the same way Reagan enforced democracy in Nicaragua, I think it's a very good first step. It's not sufficient, but it's a good first step to stop the geopolitical threat.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
You finished this book as Chávez was dying, and then you have an epilogue after Chávez is dead.
That was very generous of the publisher to allow me to write an epilogue.
But one thing you mentioned that caught my eye is that you think that Chavismo would survive without Chávez.
Yes,
and will
indeed.
Continue. Okay, tell me why.
It will, because what Chavismo created, what Chávez created in 14 years of rule, is a whole infrastructure. You have officers in the army that were purged, 800 officers were purged, and the officers politically loyal to Chávez were brought. And not only that they are politically loyal to Chávez, they also receive like good housing and expensive cars. They are living a wonderful life. Chávez created also paramilitary groups like the Bolivarian circles. Politicized, of course, the police. They also created a Boliburguesia, a group of people that benefited economically from their relation with the Bolivarian government. They created a whole infrastructure in the judiciary, in parliament, in the media, restricting the media. For instance, having full control of PDVSA, they fired the whole technocratic management in PDVSA, and they brought political loyals. People, in other words, they control the infrastructure in such a way that I believe that there will be continuity of Chavismo after Chávez. Now we have seen Nicolás Maduro, and Nicolás Maduro clearly is going to radicalize the revolution. And how do I know that? Or at least how I assume that? Because Maduro is not as charismatic as Chávez. He's weaker than Chávez. One of the things that we have seen is the huge difference between the result of the elections in October of 2012 and the gubernatorial elections of December of 2012 and the elections on April 14th. I mean, the difference was huge. I mean, Maduro won by a very small margin. What does it tell you? It tells you that Chávez's charisma was crucial. Therefore, Maduro is perceived as a weak person. He's not the same like Chávez, and he lost a lot of votes. If you look now at Capriles Radonsky now is very encouraged to continue the fight against Chávez. against Maduro, I'm sorry. When he ran against Chávez for the October elections, he was more like a chicken, was very much afraid of even confronting him. He was very polite during the electoral campaign, and now all of a sudden he has every day a speech trying to mobilize people. So what is going to happen in Venezuela now is that the population is going to be more mobilized, criticizing the government and against the government, and the result is going to be that the Venezuelan government is going to answer with even more and more repression. I don't think Maduro is going to be a pragmatist. I think Maduro is going to radicalize the revolution and is going to be even more repressive, precisely to make up for the lack of
So
charisma.
you don't believe, like so many people are saying, that, well, the economic deterioration in Venezuela, the shortages, the economic crisis is going to produce a social explosion?
There will be social explosions, but they will be repressed.
Okay, on that happy note, let me open it to the public.